So you're an entomologist by training who's spent the last 20 years making the case that specifically suburban yards, not just these parks and preserves, are where biodiversity is actually won or lost. If a friend who'd never really thought about their yard as that type of ecology asked you to explain what you actually study and what you do in a few sentences, how would you do it?
The reason I say that is that we do have these parks and we have preserves, but they're disconnected, they're isolated, and they're too small. So what's in between is where we live and we work and we play, our corporate landscapes, our suburban landscapes. So in order to make parks more effective, we have to redesign our human-dominated spaces so that they actually support biodiversity. So if something that's in a park moves outside of the park, it's not no man's land. It could still make it. And the way we designed our living spaces is through aesthetics only. We have not thought about ecological value, which is why we have 44 million acres of lawn, which doesn't accomplish any of the goals we need to accomplish at home. It's why we choose ornamental plants from other countries that don't support the biodiversity that we need to support. It's why we have light pollution everywhere, which is killing our nocturnal insects. And since insects are the little things that run the world, that is not good. So these are things that are actually relatively easy to turn around. If every landowner, every homeowner, every residential landowner, and we got 135 million acres of residential landscapes, if they thought about what they could do on their property to share their spaces with nature rather than exclude it, then we could go a long way to turning around the biodiversity crisis. So it's a real crisis. We've got 3 billion breeding birds in North America in the last 50 years, and that is continuing. 20% of our butterflies since the year 2000, and they weren't doing that well in the year 2000. Global biodiversity issues. So we need to take this seriously. And a lot of people say, why do we need biodiversity? We need it because that is what runs the ecosystems that support us. And every time you lose a species from those local ecosystems, you lose the ecosystem services, they decline. And those services, the production of oxygen and weather modification and clean water, pollination. If we lose our insects, you've lost 90% of the flowering plants on the planet. All of those things would decline. So those are the reasons we need to think about where we're living and how we landscape it.
Yeah, so you spent the first part of your career studying plant-insect interactions in pretty academic settings, a lot of time teaching, many research publications. Was there a specific moment or observation or piece of research that really flipped this from interesting science for you to I have to convince everyone to change their yard and similar type observations?
Yeah, it was actually moving into where we live now. We got 10 acres of a farm that was broken up in Oxford, Pennsylvania. And they sold it off in 10-acre lots. And when we moved in, it was totally invaded with plants from Asia. So I'd heard of invasive species, but I hadn't really encountered it in a serious way. So I realized, okay, all these plants here are from Asia, which means they're not going to support the local food web. And then I started measuring that. What insects are using the native plants versus the non-native plants? Then we started looking at what that does to the food web in terms of the things that eat insects, our birds. Then I found things that were already published, but we just hadn't put it together. Like the number of caterpillars it takes to make one clutch of chickadees. Depending on the number of chicks in the nest, it's at least 6,000. Where are those going to come from? They're not going to come from crepe myrtle and from porcelain berry and from privet and from autumn olive and all the things from Asia. So then we discovered that there are certain native plants that are actually really important. They're making most of the food web energy, and that'd be things like oaks and cherries and willows, birches. So we call them keystone plants, which expanded the discussion. It wasn't just native versus non-native, it was productive native versus non-native, because not all natives are equally productive. You're right, that all came from the research we were doing. But when we removed the invasives on our property, and by we, I really mean mostly my wife, we got to see all the things that were coming back. Yes, we planted a lot of plants, but so did the blue jays, so did the squirrels. And we've essentially restored the ecosystem on this 10 acres. And I've been taking pictures of every species of moth that is now making a living here. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years. I'm up to 1,377 species. And believe me, there weren't that many species here when we moved in. So and then we've got 62 species of birds that have bred on our property, which tells me This works. It works fast. It's easier than you think. And that is what convinced me. I've got to tell everybody else about this because we really can turn it around. It's not just academic words, as you say.
Yeah. So when a lot of people hear these types of plant native species, I know you've been talking a lot about that, they think it's a nice idea, but it's optional or maybe not required. What's part of the actual ecological science that would really surprise those people? And what's the thing that makes this a survival issue rather than just a gardening type of preference?
Nature's not optional. And if you look at the nature that's in your yard, a typical landscape yard, it's 80% non-natives. Count the number of breeding birds there. If the answer is zero, which it usually is, that's not nature. That's not a functional food web. So you've hit the nail on the head. People do not believe we actually need nature. We can watch it on television. It's fun. We like it, but it's not essential. And that's the missing part of our culture. It is essential, and we can have ecosystem collapse, and we're seeing it all over the world, actually. And the problem is humans have a big difficulty in taking the long-term view. They look at what's going to happen tomorrow, and if it's not going to happen tomorrow, they don't seem to care. Ecosystem collapse doesn't happen in one day. It happens over the years. There's also something called shifting baseline. So when you're born into a world where there's already defaunation, you've already lost a lot of species, you think that's normal. So it's not alarming to you. We in the US live in a really rich country, ecologically really rich. So we can lose a lot of species without seeing the ecosystem collapse that a lot of other countries are seeing. So those are all buffers to make us think it's not important, that we get our food from the grocery store and we get our water from the tap, and we don't need nature. But that's all artificial and it's temporary. But it is the hardest thing to convince people that this is a selfish thing we're talking about. We need to do this to preserve humanity because we've already lost 13% of the species on the planet. A mass extinction is called when you lose 75%. If we lose 75% of the species, we'll be one of them. And that's what people have a little trouble getting their head around. So it's not optional, it's essential if we want to stay on this planet in a sustainable way.
Yeah, so you talked about a little bit about this earlier. You made the case that oaks specifically are the keystone species or plants, and you back this up with a lot of data. 84% of US counties that are the most productive tree for the food web, and it can support hundreds of species of caterpillars. Can you walk me through that finding a little bit? And what does a yard versus an oak with an oak look like versus a yard without an oak?
I live in the mid-Atlantic states. The mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 557 species of caterpillars. They support over 1,000 species nationwide. Tulip trees, which is a good native tree, support 21. Yellowwood, which is a good native tree, supports 0. Crepe myrtle supports 0. That's a non-native tree. Ginkgo supports 0. Privet support maybe 3 or 4. The differences in the numbers here are tremendous. Native willows support 456 just in the mid-Atlantic states. Prunus is also 456. So there's huge numbers concentrated in just a few genera of plants. And those genera, as you move around the country, they're pretty consistent, actually. They change a little bit, but not that much. So a yard without that oak is probably not going to have breeding birds at all. So that's a yard not just without the oak, it's a yard without chickadees and titmice and cardinals and those other things. And it's cumulative. One yard without those things won't make any difference. But when most of the yards that are out there don't have them, then it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so I was looking a little bit about your book, Nature's Best Hope, trying to understand the deeper argument that a lot of this conservation can't happen on protected land because there's not enough of it left, and the math doesn't really work out. So, how much of the U.S. is fragmented suburban and private land, and what changes if even a fraction of that land gets restored partially or fully back to its native habitat?
78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So it's a huge chunk. If we don't practice conservation and private property, we're going to lose. And losing that's not an option. So that's the main argument. Excuse me. We do have we do have parks, we got preserves, but it's just a small fraction of the total land that's out there. Don't worry, I'll recover. There you go. Thank you. My wife's very helpful. That's it. That's the whole
Yeah.
argument. That's why the private landowner becomes the future of conservation. They can't depend on the parks and preserves. There's too few of them. If we cut the amount of lawn in half that we have out there, and we'll be conservative, let's say we've got 40 million acres, it's really about 44 million now. You cut that in half, that gives us 20 million acres we could restore right at home, which is bigger than all the major national parks added up together.
Yeah, I mean,
That's there it is in a
right,
nutshell.
yeah. I can say from firsthand experience, I feel very fortunate to have an oak tree that's somewhere between 200 and 300 years old in my yard.
Great.
And yeah, probably, I don't know the numbers, I haven't counted, but I see probably 15 different types of birds every morning. So
Where do you live?
there you go. So that's supporting your little finding right in my yard. But so you co-founded Homegrown National Park, a nonprofit that gets people to register their yards on a national map. As an entomologist who spent decades on this academic ecology, what's it been like to suddenly run this type of a movement? And what's taught you? What has that taught you about how people actually change their behavior towards nature?
I have found that the message that we do have big problems, but you can actually help them. You can be part of the solution. You can see the results. People are worried about the state of the planet, but they feel powerless because what can one person do? That's what Homegrown National Park tells them. There's a whole bunch of things one person can do, and you can actually see the results happening. That empowers people. And I have found that to be really a powerful thing. People they want to be part of the solution. They love being able to see something actually come to their yard that wasn't there before. We need a lot more people doing it, but it is growing quickly. We're talking about changing the culture. So we're not just we're not just adding yards that are well landscaped. We want to change culture so that they value conservation in all of their voting decisions. So if you live on the 10th floor of an apartment in the middle of a city, you don't have a lot of landscape to work with, but you can vote. And it's extremely important if you think that the biodiversity crisis is worth considering. And right now, you look at the top 10 things people are worried about, it's not even on the list. So that's why there's some urgency here. Climate change is on the list, but it's number 10. We
Yeah.
have some work to do. But
Yeah. So this is a little bit of an opinion question here, but what's the most common pushback that you hear from lawn care industry, traditional landscapers, from even neighbors or who people who think that native yards look a little messy? And where do you think they're actually wrong on the science versus where can you see why that they think what they think?
I get very little pushback from the lawn industry. I'm surprised about that because I would think they would be pushing it back. Traditional horticulturists they have a lot of trouble viewing plants as anything but decorations. They don't want to lose their favorite decorations. So their first claim is they're actually just as good as natives in supporting insects. And what they're looking at is typically bees that come to flowering plants, and they're typically honeybees, which are not native themselves. It's a reluctance to give up what they love. And I understand that. There is the concept or the opinion that native plant landscaping is the lack of landscaping and it's messy. And so homeowners associations don't want to lower property value. Whether it's messy or not depends on how you design your landscape and how you upkeep it. It's not a function of the plants that are in that landscape. So the biggest obstacle is ignorance. And that's what we keep fighting about. That's why I give a lot of talks and I write books and do all that stuff.
Yeah. So on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how worried should the average person be about the biodiversity crisis and all the work you've been documenting and we've been discussing and why that particular number?
That's a difficult question because if you've just lost your job, if AI has prevented you from getting a job and you've got to pay the rent next month, you're not going to rank the biodiversity crisis as your top worry. And there's a lot of people in the lower income levels where they're living day to day, and that's what they're worried about. In terms of the actual, if you look at a little bit longer term, I would rank it number 5. It's extremely important. And there are thresholds. If we pass thresholds, there's points beyond which it can recover. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. We have listened to the coal lobby and all these people that have put off serious action on climate change for the last 25 years, and we're really in trouble because of that. So if we do that with the biodiversity crisis as well, in China, what are they doing? They on ladders with paintbrushes trying to pollinate the fruit trees because they've lost their pollinators. That's not an option. It's not just agriculture that needs pollinators. It's 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants
Yeah.
need. And if you lose your plants, you lose everything. So it's all connected and it's much more urgent than most people think. So I would rank it very highly, but it'd be difficult to convince the guy who's trying to feed his kids tomorrow. That's what he should worry about.
Yeah. Yeah, so following that, what's one specific thing that a regular person who's maybe not a researcher or someone with a big yard can plan or do that actually contributes to rebuilding the food web?
Could turn out their lights at night or put a yellow bulb in their outdoor lights because yellow wavelengths don't attract nocturnal insects. We've got that's one of the major causes of insect declines is our light pollution at night, and it's totally unnecessary. Very easy. One trip to the hardware store, you switch your light bulbs.
Yeah. So, who are a few scientists or thinkers that you think I should interview after you? It doesn't have to be in your specific entomology or native plant field, but just any environmental scientist who you think would be interesting.
You might try Dave Wagner at the University of Connecticut. He is an entomologist. He works on caterpillars, really concerned about global insect decline and the impact of climate change on it. Drought is what's clobbering insects, and then everything that requires them.
So I got one more question. I like to ask every scientist this. I've gotten some pretty interesting answers. I've gotten 3 word answers, and I've gotten 50 word answers. And it's if every teenager on Earth had to hear one final sentence from you, what would it be?
I'll give you a one-word answer. 2 words: personal responsibility. Now I'll elaborate. We have this idea that we can own a piece of the earth. And when you own the earth, you can do whatever you want with it. No, you can't, because whatever you do on your little piece of the earth impacts everything around you. How you treat the property, I always say it's not like Las Vegas. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Whatever happens on your property does not stay on your property, either for good or for bad. So you have a responsibility to yourself, to your neighbors, to all the life around you, to landscape in a way that's going to support local ecosystems.
All right.
That is responsibility as a member of this planet, and nobody knows that. So that's my final word.
Yeah, this was a very informative interview. I really enjoyed talking with you. I'll obviously be in contact soon, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, I just thought of somebody else you should talk to. His name is William Sweet. How old are you?
I'm 14.
Okay, he's not a whole lot older than you. He's, I don't know, 21 or something, but he's still in college, I think. But he's a real go-getter in terms of policy. So you guys should connect.
Have a nice day.